For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. I'm a big admirer of my guest today. Bill Binch is one of the best sales leaders I've ever met in the SaaS space. It was great to get his take on sales, customers, and metrics. If you're a leader whose role includes assuring that customers either get value from your solution or deliver value to your bottom line, I think you'll learn a lot. Bill today is an operating partner at Battery Ventures, an investment firm focused on tech companies, where he coaches and advises sales leadership in the portfolio companies. Before that, he was Chief Revenue Officer at Pendo, where he helped drive the annual recurring revenue to north of 100 million ARR in just 3 years. He spent 9 years at Marketo, leading sales as the company grew from its infancy to its IPO and beyond that. And he held sales leadership positions at other heavy hitters in the software space like Oracle, PeopleSoft, BEA. So it was great from my perspective to get Bill talking about how sales fits into the organization, its role in thinking about the ideal customer profile, its use of metrics. A few of Bill's points that I think you should listen for. Sales should be invested in renewals as well as new business because, let's face it, it's critical to company success. But it is critical to align incentives and work hard to cross those internal gaps that can easily form in companies, especially as they scale. Collaboration between sales and other departments, marketing, customer experience, customer success. Well, that rests on a shared understanding of the metrics and the markers of progress. So clarity from his perspective is key. And as a sales leader and an executive, he really believes that more is better when it comes to data, when it comes to anything, but also around the customer experience. And the urgency around frequent updates only grows in an era of big data. Well, Bill, welcome and thanks for taking the time to join us today. Appreciate your time. Let me start. Given your long pedigree in sales, I'm gonna cut to a topic which I think, from a customer experience perspective, a lot of customer experience professionals, if you like, tend to zero in when they think of sales. So there's always been this notion that salespeople are insufficiently concerned about the long-term health of the deals they sell. And in a subscription-oriented business or a lifetime-oriented business, which you've been involved with personally for most of your, certainly recent part of your career, and now in your role at Battery, does the sales, first of all, is that an unfair accusation? Are we mischaracterizing sales leaders as too myopic when it comes to the nature of deals they sell? Is it a problem with incentives? What are your thoughts on, in a subscription business, should sales be doing something different?
So on the mischaracterization question, I think that's a little unfair because, especially if you're speaking about a sales leader, that person's an executive in the organization. And executives have to wear two hats. They have their daily hat of, I have the sales role, I have to go acquire customers, I have to expand those customers. And as we know, a lot of sales leadership doesn't own the renewal and the customer success function, but they're certainly thinking about that because the other hat that they wear, which is called a company hat or an executive hat, says the value of my company is largely determined on what our ability to cross-sell and keep customers are. And so whether I own it or not, I think I'm invested in that element. Now, is it an issue of compensation or org structure? Possibly that could drive the chasm. I mean, it's the classic go-to-market. You have marketing to sales to CS, really in that flow, in that supply chain. And normally you don't have one single owner of all those. Normally it's the CEO that owns that. And so you get that rift, like I had an old CMO I worked with that did a play upon that book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. He said marketing is from Mars and sales is from Venus, to talk about that chasm that exists. And then the next chasm downstream from that is the sales to CS chasm of where does sales end and where does CS or CX pick up on that. But like I said, I think fundamentally leadership tends to think about that. Now, as you get into a larger organization, Richard, I do think it's possible that you have sales reps that perhaps are driven on just a pure hunter type of plan. Their whole job is just to acquire the company. And is that person thinking about the downstream? Maybe not as much, but that's where I think you're optimistic that you've hired good actors that are selling deals that are ultimately good for the organization.
Do you think that, and that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I think that certainly, yeah, if you've got a sales leader who isn't thinking about the enterprise value, then it's not a C-level sales leader, right? They're not fulfilling that role. I would say I didn't mean to suggest that it's really malicious intent as much as a challenge of alignment, right? As you go through the organization, the tendency, especially when you have hunter-orientated sales companies, the challenge is you're holding people very, very accountable for putting, new deals on the table every quarter, and at the same time, looking qualitatively at those deals and saying, is this going to be a really good customer for us? If we all go back and you've had a long enough and storied enough career to remember the days of on-prem software sales, and on-prem software sales, certainly when I was running an on-prem company, you cared about that quarter. You could do a lot of business in the last day of the quarter. You do a lot of business in the last half hour of the quarter, right? And so this notion of, do you sell to an ideal customer that's going to be a lifetime relationship with upsell and cross-sell potential, wasn't economically that important in on-prem companies. I mean, you'd collect the maintenance stream on the back end. I would argue, and I'd love your point of view, that the shift to SaaS fundamentally changed that economic equation. And I wonder whether you'd agree that sales and marketing organizations have fully caught up with the reality of lifetime value as distinct from transactional value. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I think they very much have. I think if you look at the stage as in maturity of companies, a lot of times when you start selling, your head of sales, that leader is also oftentimes the head of customer success. Why? Because they're both commercial transactions. One, you sign the customer, one, you renew the customer. Let's give it to Billy, and let him run it. But as a company grows, you tend to get more focused, right? So that's where sales becomes very sales focused, and then CS becomes its a whole specific area that you have another team focus on. Then sales might even get even more specified by we have new versus expansion, or we have segmented. And I think, so from that perspective, I think that you're right. There's some organizational alignment things that happens. Is that one day I owned it all. When I owned it, I ran it and it was great. But then, we hired this other person to come in, and that's where maybe a little bit of the gap started getting created. But the ICP is an interesting place to go, because I do think when you're early stage, you start a company, you conceptualize who your ideal customer profile is. And the way you prove that is probably by going and selling to anybody that knocks on your door or realistically is willing to buy. And that's a hard shift for, I think, a sales leader to make, because number one, you're getting experience. You're getting laps around the block, I call it, because you're selling to customers and they may not be your ideal lifetime customer. But how do you know that until you sell a couple of those folks and then you lose a couple of those folks? But your analogy, Richard, back to the on-prem years is interesting, because honestly, there's, I think, a lot of metrics of how we measure companies today in the cloud world that probably didn't exist, or conceptually we didn't think about back then, because today you think about things like Rule of 40 that we apply to a company, net retained revenue that we apply to a company. And if you look at really well-run companies, they apply those metrics not just to the overall business, but to each segment of the business. It could be, a size of selling to small business or enterprise. It could be a vertical. It could be a geo or something like that. And it's a really interesting question, because as you start selling as an organization, you start getting that experience of who our ideal customer profile is. And now you start seeing what's the perfect customer, right? Who is the person that buys, that expands, that sticks with us, that stands on our stage, and does references and does speeches and gives case studies and things like that. And it's a learning process of the stages of maturity for a company to go through.
Yeah, and you know, if I think back now over the last decade, our notion of what a good performance is has sort of changed. So the idea of what good net recurring revenue has changed. I think when Snowflake went public, a lot of people looked at their performance just nominally in terms of their expansion rate within accounts and said, for a company of their scale and size, these were really eye-popping metrics. You know, when you start to get to 200% NRR, maybe declining to 150 as they grow to scale. I think people had calibrated a decade ago on, you know, having churn rates of 90% and thought, oh, it's pretty good. We lose 10% of our customers a year. That's not too bad. It seems like the bar's gone up a lot because the potential has been realized that if you can get your existing customers to expand, that's the cheapest, you know, by far way of growing a company. And that changes the whole economic equation for growth, right?
100%. I mean, I think of the 2000, like the year 2000, kind of the start of cloud software to 2010, maybe 12. The metrics that we focused on were your revenue, not even ARR, right? Because revenue was a trailing indicator of what happened, and your growth rate. And I think around that 10, 12 period is when you started seeing people get really savvy that the enterprise valuation of a SaaS software company was really on your ability to go back and grow your customer base and keep your customer base. And that's when NRR, NDP, whatever you want to define it as, became a really critical value. And you're right. At first, it started off as like, well, for every dollar that I sold, I want to get $1.01 or more of expansion the following year. And then guidelines started getting created out there of what was good, what was great, what was not so good, and stuff like that. So you're absolutely right. I think it's just the evolution of how we metric and value a business like the ones that we're in.
You write a lot about metrics and forecasting, you know, pipeline, you know, good technique for all of that. Do you see that changing with new technologies? Is there opportunities for us to get more sophisticated around that? Is you know, AI technologies, for example, not necessarily riding the obvious bandwagon here, but are there new technologies that are going to make it far more effective for us to make sales teams more accurate, more productive, get better data? Or is this intrinsically a human function that we're going to have trouble making better?
I have two thoughts on this. I'll try and articulate them as succinctly as I can. I think there's a process which I would put into the camp, Richard, of more the human side, and then there's a technology element. And I think there's always pros and cons to both these things. On the process side, I think there definitely are new metrics that we start looking at creating that of how we go and measure the performance of our businesses. I also think that sometimes too many metrics can make us forget about the first principles. Like a topic that I've been chatting with a lot of companies about lately is the whole concept of creating pipeline versus converting pipeline. And I think a lot of companies get caught up on, well, what's our conversion rate of pipeline that's come in, right? Like someone's knocked on our door and asked for a demo, or they've asked for a data sheet, or they've signed up for a webinar or something like that. And what percentage of those do we convert into a meeting, into a demo, into giving a price proposal? That's all good, but that's conversion, which is definitely an important metric. But right now, in a tough economic time, I think companies have to go a step before that. I think we've forgotten about this, of talking about creation. And creation is two-sided. It's on a marketing side and a sales side. Creation is, if a marketer generates 1,000 visitors a month to their site, how do they create 1,100? Not how do they convert the 1,000 to like 50%, took a meeting or something like that, but how do they take the 1,000 and turn it into 1,100? How do they grow during this time of, you know, economic challenges? And likewise for sales, they're equally on the hook. there's always an element of sales about going out and creating outbound business. And so how is that team doing that? And so that's kind of a first principle thing that I look at in today's day and age and think, that doesn't take more technology. I mean, maybe there's some technology that will help drive that, but are you tracking that is the first issue that you have to get to. So fundamentally, where I think about on that is, I think marketers really need to be measured on pipeline. And I find that I talk with a lot of marketers who get really caught up down in the weeds. They get caught up in how many visitors, how many MQLs, how many of those MQLs converted to SQLs. And while those are all things that I think a marketer should track as part of their food chain, their supply chain, I think at the end of the day, when they speak with executives, when they speak with sales, when they speak with their investors, that they need to talk about pipeline, because boards don't talk MQL. Boards don't talk SQL. And likewise, the salesperson, that person also equally has to speak the right language. And their language in my mind is conversions. Marketing sets the ball up, whether it's marketing generated, sales generated, or partner generated. It was marketing who created your market message. It created your brand, and it created the actual storylines that the salespeople are out there projecting, or the partners are out there projecting. And so the best companies that I see led out there right now, you have alignment between the marketer and the sales leader. On the marketer talks about, this is how much pipeline we generated, and it was up or down from what our expectations were. Our cost per metrics were in line or not in line. Then the salesperson is over there talking about, and we converted at these rates, and these rates are high or low versus what our expectations were and what our historicals were and stuff like that. You'll notice, Richard, everything I just talked about there didn't really belie a technological thing. So I think there is that human element, that process element, before you get to technology that you have to think about. And then I do think there's some great technologies out there that are helping drive some of those factors. So I think there's a combination of the two.
Yeah, interesting. So one of the things we've certainly observed over the year when we look at how customers form their attitudes, and and I think it's somewhat unique in software, and it was always explained to me this way. Software is one of the few products in the world where the customer has no idea what they purchased the day they sign the contract, right? And the theory being that software is too complicated for a customer to fully understand, and it's a moving target, which is one of the appeals of it, because it's constantly innovating. And there's even been studies done that show that when you ask customers what they think they purchased, they confuse different vendors or features from different vendors. So they've even sort of lost track. If they've seen a dozen vendors present, they have a habit of combining features from them into what they think they're buying. So you've got this fundamental problem that customers don't fully understand what they purchased. And then there's this kind of reconciliation process that needs to take place post-contract. And then there's cost to serve, which typically occurs even further down the line, a large part of which is driven by how well we did further upstream, right? So logically, if we sold to the ideal customer profile, if we did a fantastic job aligning their expectations, if we onboarded them beautifully, they will have lower recourse to other types of cost-oriented functions downstream, tech support or customer success. With that in mind, is there a case for us to be more selective in how we sell? I mean, if we truly optimize the equation, should we be thinking in terms of narrowing down our targets? Because at the end of the day, the profitability, the lifetime profitability of the customer could be a lot better. Or is that just too many dots to join up?
Complex one. Look, there's two thoughts I have on this. Number one, you mentioned on-prem world. I feel fortunate, Richard, that I was working when the internet came into the business world. So that was one fundamental shift. I was working when we did the shift from on-prem software to cloud software, and that was great. I was in the working world as mobile became a real thing on our phones. And then over the last decade, we've watched product-led growth, PLG, come in. And now we have AI, which you brought up in the last question. Now we have AI. I think those are both really exciting concepts. I think to your question of do customers understand what they're buying? I do think that there's a future ahead where there is going to be more emphasis on try before you buy. And that's where these PLG companies, and look, I fully accept that not every company is going to be able to go deliver. There are some very complex products that require, as you know, a lengthy implementation. And those ones probably may not be right for that model. But I do think it's a really great place for companies to challenge themselves that maybe were in existence before the PLG wave caught hold and think, well, could I deliver this in a way to my user so that they do know what they're getting before they've bought it? And I think that's a really just fascinating idea because it's selling to the user base, and then there's a separate sale to the economic buyer, right? And the PLG motion to me is about consuming the user and getting those folks to say, hey, boss, I really like this. It's making me more productive. It's helping me in my job, whatever the impact that it's having is. So I think that's really interesting. So and stop there. That's one thought process. The other thing that leaps into my mind is, and granted, Richard, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I may be a bit trained one way, but I started my career as a telesales rep. And at the time, telesales was the fastest distribution model that existed at that time. And I've always been fascinated by velocity models. And one of the things that I like about high volume or velocity models is, going back to what we talked about in the first question, is you get customer experience. And that's how you learn things. And so I love that idea. And so the idea to me of choosing your customers, there's some romance in that idea, but there's also this concept to me that says, wow, don't I want to proliferate my software out there as far and as wide as I can? Understanding that my ICP might be capped by a number of companies that I could sell to or something like that. I don't know. That one, like I said, for an old school velocity guy, is a tough one to get my head around.
Well, I thought your point about, it's an evolution for companies, right? So early on, and I speak from personal experience here. Yes, you want to learn and you take the business where you find it. And right. I think that you don't know yourself necessarily what the perfect customer profile is going to be. And it might surprise you. You can do it, as you said, on paper or just pull it from the air and say, okay, I think this is right. But the market has a habit of educating you on the reality of this, not necessarily in bad ways. It can surprise you in that some company that you thought there's no way our product or service is applicable to these guys, and they find something that you had not conceivably thought of that turns out to be really successful. So the high velocity model just gives you so much more opportunity to test that and to find the at bats. And I thought your point is interesting about the product led model. Look, at the end of the day, if our problem is customers don't really fully understand what they buy, then a PLM model sort of closes that gap very, very efficiently. They get to experience the product, then they understand it. And then that gap is essentially closed because they have hands-on first-time experience with it. And those products also tend to be much simpler in any case, right, to make that work. And so they can get their head around it. I mean, a lot of products that we all love, you wouldn't necessarily have intuited the real value until you actually put your hands on it, right? It takes trial.
So, I mean, this is where I think the invasion of B2C concepts coming into B2B apps is happening. I mean, the iPhone came out in 2007, so we're a little past 15 years. And if you think about the impact that that's had, I mean, Richard, can you imagine if you went to an app store and downloaded an app and it said, hey, give us 15 minutes. We need to provision your account, or give us 3 days so we can enable your instance and get it up and running. You as a consumer would be like, I'll delete that and I'll go find the next best thing that gets me the instant usage of it. And so I think that mindset is definitely come in. I mean, you see it in functionality. If you think about our emails on our phone, we probably swipe left to delete and swipe right to save it or whatever. And right, where'd that come from? That came from a dating app. And And like, now we're all used to scrolling on Windows because we're used to that user interface of a real type of thing. And I'm starting to see that show up inside of business applications. And so I think it's interesting, the PLG, like you said, initially was very focused on B2B apps that were easy to consume, but you are starting to see more complex apps show up that at least a portion of them you can start by using, and then you hit some type of ceiling or some type of paywall, and that's where you have to go to the more, I think, enterprise version of it.
You touched on this a little bit earlier when we're sort of referencing current economic conditions. It was pretty interesting that recently, as you know, Salesforce was under a lot of pressure from investors, and I think Mark Benioff made some statement to the effect of, in the history of the company, we've never concerned ourselves with efficiency, which I thought was in of itself a really remarkable thing to say. Sort of encapsulates in some ways the software industry for the last 20 years, which was, well, efficiency is nice, but at the end of the day, if you're growing, damn the torpedoes. I guess two-part question. One is, are we entering into a period where efficiency matters? And I suppose the second part of the question depends on whether you agree with that statement. If we are entering a period of efficiency matters, does that change the way we think about selling, marketing, servicing customers? Does the whole equation change in an industry where efficiency matters? But would you agree that efficiency matters more now?
Oh, I think very much so. I think almost every company that I speak to, all of my friends that are in technology, are all talking about the shift of how their growth plans were fueled by adding more people, more systems to their model to drive the growth rate so that they could become optimized on acquiring customers and acquiring ARR, to where now the thought process is maybe we dial down that growth rate and add this element of a target towards break even or a target towards profitability into the model. And I think if you just look at Wall Street Journal, you'll see that there's a lot of data out there that reflects that the more highly valued companies are ones that have made that transition. So I think that efficiency focus is certainly happening out there right now. Is it driving a change in selling? 100%. Is it driving change in marketing? 100%. Because I can tell you how that happens. A CEO goes to their heads of those functions, the heads of marketing, says, I need you to be more efficient. What does that mean? It means I probably am going to get less budget than I did last year and fewer people.
With the same goals or higher goals.
Or higher
That's
goals.
efficiency.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
efficient.
So going back to what I said about creation and conversion of pipeline. And so same thing goes to the sales leader. That person gets fewer reps. I need them to be, I need their actual production to be higher. I need their quotas to be higher. And then CS, how does that affect that team? Well, if you handled 15 accounts as your book of business last year, I need you to handle 25 this year, right? Everybody feels that focus on efficiency. And look, like some companies were already probably running fairly efficiency. So that probably is like not just cutting the skin, that's cutting into the bone a bit. But, there's other companies that probably weren't that efficient. And that was probably a healthy, transition to go through of saying, wait, we can be we can run probably a lot more tightly on the number of people and deliver the same level of marketing, the same level of sales, and the same level of customer service.
Slightly different topic, and I'd love your perspective. By the way, there's no loaded answer here at all. I'm interested in your perspective from a sales leader on measurements like Net Promoter Score. Is it a useful thing? Is it a distraction? Is it a good idea but insufficient? I mean, when you've sat through management team meetings and they've talked about, okay, we have these survey results, which is and my perspective on this was a very old-fashioned way of doing things. But in this traditional universe where people survey customers and got the data, when you're sitting around the table as a head of sales or a head of sales and marketing, president role, which you've had on occasion, What's your perspective on that?
So I'm a big fan of data points. I'll use a sales analogy here. Like, Bill, what's your forecast? Well, I don't have just one forecast as a sales leader. I have a tops down forecast where I look at my pipeline and I apply historical conversion rates. I have a bottoms up forecast. I probably have a few tools that are predictive of what my forecast is going to be. And so when I give my forecast, I want as much data as I can to be able to do that, so that when Richard, you as the CEO, ask me, why is your forecast that, I can say, well, here's the top down, here's the bottoms up, here's what the other predictive one said, and this is what I've come up with, and this is what my framework that I applied is. And so that you go, okay, I may not like the answer, but I at least understand how you got there. Right. So using that analogy, I apply that similarly to like Net Promoter Score and CSAT. One thing that I think we can do that's not always a positive is we can confuse our customers, because I go and ask them for some type of survey information when I'm looking for Net Promoter Score. Well, am I looking for them to evaluate my product or my service? And a lot of times the answer is yes. And you're left like, I'm not sure. So on that point, as a business leader, I like as many data points as I can. So there's Net Promoter Scores, there's CSAT, there's different types of surveys that you can do. And it's, again, like that analogy of forecasting. It allows me to get hopefully a picture around my customer base of how they're feeling, of what their pulse is. And I like that a lot. So I'm a believer of data. I'm a believer of really understanding with frequent touches what my customers are. I've definitely in the last decade picked up my interest level or urgency on wanting to feel that pulse with more frequency, because I think a lot of times, we would do an annual survey of the customer, or they've done a transaction, do a survey. And I think understanding how they are across the long term, like when we go back to the lifetime value of the agreement, is really valuable.
Well, I hope a lot of people in leadership positions share that point of view, because that's certainly where we're betting the farm. Bill, it's been a fascinating conversation. One of the things I thought was most interesting, in fact, was the last topic we touched in, when you talked about the idea of being a fan of data, which means at the end of the day, there's no single piece of information. What we really do add value to with experience as leaders, one would hope, is the ability to assimilate data, personal perspective, and put it together. And I think that this idea that any form of technology, AI or anything, is going to replace human judgment, I think, is flawed in the scenarios we're talking about. I think at the end of the day, we want to get co-pilots for people. And I think the more information we can provide people to nudge them or help them make better decisions, that's where the productivity could come from, right? That we're all going to get better at decision making because data informs us better. And I think you made that point with the way in which you think about forecasting really elegantly. There's no one such thing as a forecast. At the end of the day, there is a forecast, which is the one you represent, but you're building that up from multiple views. And I think that's true for just about how anyone in a leadership position should make decisions. Assimilate as much useful data as they can, and then ultimately apply their judgment, which is the experience that we expect from leaders. So that's a really good point to sort of end this on. Thank you.
I'll add a comment to it.
Yeah, please.
I'm excited. Like, again, was here for the internet, was here for cloud, was here for mobile, PLG, and now this AI thing. I think it's just really exciting to lean into, because as you know, I spent 10 years at Marketo. And if you really look back at what Marketo started off as, it was this workflow engine, right? You imported your lead database, you imported or built assets inside of this tool, and then you created these nurture campaigns. AI didn't exist then. So if you applied AI to that today and you're starting all over, what could it assist in? Well, I have my database. I'm going to put that in. I need to create assets. Maybe it can be helpful in offloading of me manually creating all those assets. And therefore, you just use the word productivity. I am more productive. Maybe it could help me build those nurture campaigns. Maybe it doesn't do it at first, but maybe it observes the campaigns that I made and sees what works and is connecting and what doesn't work and recommends to me, do more of this. And so I love that application of it, because if that application to business apps, because if you think about B2B apps, a lot of them are really workflows, right? That's what we try to automate and make easier for us as human beings. And now this AI is adding content and thought to those things. And if that can help me do my job, I'm excited to lean into that. So I think there's some really great excitement out there around where this can go.
Well, and tied back to the idea that we may be in an era of efficiency for a long time. And, it's fine to say, let's, raise targets and cut jobs. But at the end of the day, unless something fundamentally changes, I mean, yes, maybe we can cream skim off some inefficiency in businesses.
Right.
But unless something fundamentally changes to make our people more productive and better at their jobs for the same inputs, you don't have efficiency, right? So I think you're talking about how we make people more successful is the real potential of technology here. It's making the human beings in the equation 2 to 3 times more successful at their jobs, and that is a very exciting era. And maybe efficiency is the catalyst for that. We needed this. We needed to suddenly concern ourselves with capital efficiency and human efficiency, because that would provoke us into doing more innovative ideas as to how to get people successful. Bill, absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure doing it.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.